Thanks, Chris. And we're going to have a panel for about the next hour and a quarter where we look at designing age-friendly homes and communities, the role of innovative design. Now, I just want to give you a bit of a sense about how this panel is going to go. We have 4 terrific people on the panel today. Valerie Fletcher, the Executive Director of the Institute for Human-Centered Design. David Hoagland, the Principal and Executive Director of Perkins Eastman. Amy Scheckman, the President and CEO of the Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly. And Katie Swenson, the Vice President for National Design Initiatives from Enterprise Community Partners. We're going to start the day with a presentation by David talking about innovations in design. Then Valerie, Amy, and Katie are each going to speak for about 5 minutes, although some of this will be interactive. And then the panel is going to engage in a conversation about these issues. We'll open it up for questions and then transition into the issue of policy. Actually, we're all meant to be sitting up at the front, but I think because David is going to present, it would be good if you just maybe presented, and then once we're through David's presentation, we can move up to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. I've spent enough time in the New York area that I talk quick, but I'm hoping that my heart from my Midwestern roots comes through as well. I have had the really fortunate opportunity of spent 30 years in the senior living industry from a design perspective. And I have witnessed the kind of change that has happened. And I started my career by going to Northern Europe and looking what was happening in the early 80s and looking at that as models that we could bring here and begin to think about the kind of change that we could make. So I think that as we look at this issue of aging, as we saw with the study, how do we begin to make those stories personal? How do we begin to understand the individuals, the complexity in those numbers, the kinds of challenges that people are living through every day? And we can know that as we look at generational shifts, that there are certain life experiences and things that bring with them the kinds of challenges about what people's expectations are about their aging and their future, the kind of housing they want to live in, and certainly the kind of financial considerations that we look at across the generations. There's also been an enormous amount of research looking at how consumer interests have changed. And we begin to look at the fact that issues around choice and privacy and things that maybe we've all taken for granted become much more amplified as we begin to look at those choices, because historically the industry 20, 30 years ago was not very focused on choice and variety, resident involvement in policy, and involvement of residents even in a design process. We also have found a way over history to take these different types of housing and try to segment them. And a lot of that has to do with reimbursement, licensure, building codes. And what they've done for us is they've created a vast array of very confusing acronyms, words, and types that make that challenge for us to even begin to have a common language about the kinds of things that we want to have. And I think that issue around choice and variety and expectation is fortunately blurring those edges between the things that we might have called nursing care or licensed environments, assisted living, and housing. And what we're seeing is taking some of those things from the past and begin to look at the future and seeing things like colleges and universities interested in establishing lifelong learning and intergenerational campuses, or the greenhouse, which we'll talk about in a few seconds, or senior condominiums and things that are paired with services. And I think underlying all that are the things that were coming out of the study, which are what are the financial drivers that make that possible for people who may not have the resources or the ability to pay for those. One of the things that has been fascinating to me is how change happens. And I began to look at this not just through the filter of senior living, but just in life in general, and watching 3 kids. We were sharing stories over lunch about teenage boys and what happens to them when they grow up. I'm still waiting, still waiting. But I think that as we begin to look at society and we look at those sort of drivers that came out of the study, is that we know that we're in the midst of this huge aging wave or aging tsunami. We're beginning to look at these statistics that are really confronting us to begin to think differently. And change happens in gradual ways. As I said, generational shifts begin to drive that, life experiences. But sometimes there can be events that really make things happen. And so when we watch what happened in 2008 with the stock market plunge and the housing market, one of the things that we were very curious about as people who design buildings, and did anybody want to build any buildings in 2009 and 10, was we went out to our clients and we asked them, we said, so what's going on? What are people thinking about now? How has this changed? And two of the questions we asked them was, is the traditional entry fee retirement community, is it endangered? Is it dead? Is this a model that people are going to look at in the future? And of that cross-section across the country, about 67% of the clients said that they really felt it was endangered, that there needed to be more models, there needed to be more choices out there. The other question we asked them was, had the current residential market changed, collapse of the residential market, people's investments, had that impacted how they viewed what their life choices would be as they aged and looked for retirement options? And that became an overwhelming answer also. Maybe things that we might have expected coming out of that. But this issue of looking for early predictors of change. How do we know when change begins to happen? I'm sure many of you are familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's book, very interesting, about sort of that tipping point when sort of things begin to reach a crescendo where they all of a sudden sort of spill over and become something that becomes more endemic. People are more interested. People begin to adopt those ideas. And so if we look historically at other industries, or we begin to think about how change has happened, you can look at the Model T, and Ford owned everything. He owned the railroads that got the supplies to his plants. He owned the rubber places in Brazil for the tires. He owned absolutely everything. He controlled the whole process to make a car. Or you can look at LG, which was Korean, which really was making all the component parts for a lot of the products that were used before it actually became LG as a brand that now we all see on our TVs and our refrigerators and our washing machines. So they were actually the component manufacturers for many of those, and actually also the catalyst for a lot of the research that went into flat screen TVs. And I think it's also interesting, and maybe it's because I have college-age kids, is that the idea that colleges and universities have begun to figure how to partner, how to bring other people in that do things maybe better than they do, to run the bookstore or run the dining programs or be able to provide those choices, and how a simple thing like a college ID now becomes something that's a financial instrument in the way you buy and spend your money, having loaded money on that card regularly. I think the other thing that we begin to see is that I think this is part of this generational of maybe that beginning shift of shifting from things to experiences. And I think that's a lot about what we talk in design right now. And so, 20 years ago, or even maybe 10 years ago, if I were to interview people about what they wanted in the common areas of where they live, they probably would have said a coffee shop. But I can tell you 99.9% of the time now the answer to that question is they want a Starbucks. And what is it? We can buy Starbucks coffee at the grocery store now, and you can get the cups. It's the experience that comes with that name. So the sort of social aspect of it, the internet cafe, the sort of experience side, I think, is very, very important. And so I think those begin to inform the way maybe we'll begin to think about what some of those new options and choices are out there. But one of the overriding things that we know, and the study certainly amplifies that, is that people are going to want to stay at home however they define home. And it may not be defined the same way for future generations as it is or has been in the past. We know from surveys that are out there, 90% of the population say that they want to stay at home and they want to stay in their communities. And for some people, that's how they define staying at home. It's being in their community. They may change from housing product, the big 4-bedroom house, to an apartment or other option. But one of the things that we haven't done very well is figuring out how we're going to serve them. And I think the statistics around what the suburban and rural areas of our country look like are particularly challenging. And we know that with all of those questions comes the things about how does aging in place really happen? And it isn't just that the housing stock has all of those accessible features. We know it needs to be partnered with the services and the social opportunities that keep people engaged in their communities. We know that sectors of the aging demographics will be looking for different things and have different needs. And we know that caregiving is a reality that we haven't solved. And as we look at smaller families, statistics and stories that were shared in the previous presentation, we know that those are going to be the challenges as we go in the future. And I know that my 22 and 24-year-old will not be providing my services. My daughter probably will. So we can look at different places. We can look internationally to sort of see how people are looking at this. This is the Humanitas organization that you could look at this. It's sort of a service center. It provides housing into the community. The idea is that it is an apartments for life concept, that you stay there and they bring in any of the healthcare or supportive services. The first floor has a grocery store, restaurants, community-based services. And so can we learn about these other models that don't unbundle it, but actually bundle those pieces together and look at the service side as well as the setting or the building side? We also know that we can deal with universal design and physical features, and there's a lot of things we can do in apartment design, everything from the doorways and features that were talked about in the presentation, but even to the softer side of, is there that extra den or alcove or nook because maybe the caregiver is visiting 3 or 4 nights a week? Are there things, or is there full time? We certainly know that the promise of the smart house technology that we've been looking at for the last 20 or 30 years is seeing that promise. You can watch the TV commercial where the father turns off the water, the heat, the lights at the house that the son just left, and didn't turn any of that off, and does that all remotely. So there's certainly the promise of technology that will integrate life. We also know that we're going to be able to see more personable wearable technology. And what's interesting to me, particularly being an architect dealing with the built environment, is the kind of technologies that provide information for people as they navigate. So, for instance, I saw, and it's one of those articles and presentations I wish I had kept track of, but somebody was developing a set of shoes that, like little kids' sneakers that have the little blinky lights in the back when they walk. It was made for older adults, and the blinky parts were on the front. And if your body posture wasn't right over your feet, it would flash yellow. If you were at fear of risk, it would be, or at risk of falling, it would be red, and green if you were standing over your feet. So how do we get that sort of biofeedback and make sure the environment's safe, but how do we make it easier for people to adapt and live in the environments? And then there are people that are piloting these kinds of things. This is Eschaton out in California, where we could take Smart House to its basic, like is there a bedroom on the first floor, and is there an entrance that people can get in and out of easily? And they've been adopting a program not unlike the goals of LEED for sustainability, where they would certify new construction home builders to have livable design houses, so that those people that are moving in and making those life choices at 60 have those options when they're 80 and 85. We can also look abroad, and we can look at other things that maybe we're only at the leading edge of understanding. This is a product from Denmark, Presselit, which actually we did use on Newbridge and the Charles here, components of it, but the idea is that all of the fixtures in the bathroom are movable. They slide on a rail, so people can actually fit out the bathroom and adjust where the sink is, where the toilet is, where the grab bars are, where the medicine cabinet is, bins, storage, and you can move everything around. So whether you have disability issues, left side, right side, we can adjust that physical environment to you. We couldn't quite figure out with plumbing codes how to make the toilet move in the US, but we did use it for all of the other pieces. I think one of the things that is also very interesting to us is that there's been a lot written about universal design and how we adapt the physical environment to be supportive of older adults. But you only have to look at the statistics out there and what we're going to be dealing with cognitive impairment to really understand how deep these issues are. So one pilot program we worked on was something called A House for Betty, where yes, it had all the universal design features, but it had about 100 other features that were focused on how the house would progress and age with an individual with cognitive impairment. And this is something we think that we need to begin to look at, that it's not only just the physical nature of the house, but how do we support it from a social and intellectual capacity as well. As we said, a lot is changing in this industry, and I think this is one of the exciting things is that we have a lot of people out there rejecting the products that we've built to date. People that, even in subsidized housing, don't want to live in a tiny 300 square foot studio. Or we have people that sort of say, the long-term care nursing home of the past is certainly not where they want to be. And I attribute a lot of the change to, I think, people that are of my generation, where we're making and looking at options for our parents and saying, no way for mom or dad, and hell, never for me. So we're going to make change, and we're going to find ways to do that. And so the greenhouse, small house movement, and creating these small 10, 12-bed houses that are licensed as skilled nursing, long-term care, nursing home, whichever word you want to use, I think is at that leading edge of beginning to sort of say what other models are out there. And there isn't one size that fits all, but I think there's a broader and bigger question, which is what is the role of the nursing home or skilled care in the future? As we watch more medical devices, more technology coming into the single-family home to support people at home, will we begin to see that diminish to the point where long-term care really becomes around rehabilitation and end-of-life care? And I think when I first started in this industry, if I were to talk to clients about their nursing homes, they would talk about the average length of stay in years. They would talk about somebody who had been there 7 years or 10 years, and maybe the average was 4 or 5 years living in a nursing home. I'd say the last 3 or 4 years, our clients talk in months, and I actually had a client last week talk in weeks, that the average length of stay was less than 6 months. So constant turnover, changing because we're beginning to look differently about what those needs are. I think we also need to look for models that engage our cities. This is a project, St. John's on the Lake in Milwaukee, which is really right in the heart of the urban center. Fortunately, the heart of the urban center is on the water too, so you get to take pictures with sailboats in the front. But beginning to engage the community with an art gallery and a restaurant on the first floor that's open to the public. This is a project we've done 7 retirement communities in Japan. This was one in Ginza where they partnered with a hospital to provide a clinic on the second floor that's open to the community. The first floor has a dining option that's open to the community at large. It is on a shopping street, so it has a lot of good retail experiences for people, and really tries to engage the community in a broader look at how they provide services. So we're looking across cultures to sort of see how we can solve these issues. I think one of the interesting questions that was asked this afternoon at lunch was, so, how is Japan or China doing it differently? And the scary thing is they're adopting what we're doing here. And we keep saying, you don't have to do that. It's driven by reimbursement, building codes and things. And why would you do it the way we're doing? Because what we're doing isn't right. And with one client in Japan for 17 years, we are evolving to those new models with them. I think the other thing we're seeing is that the development community's interested in sort of this demographic and people that may want to change, want to stay in the heart of their community, right downtown. I think the example Chris used. This is a project in Scarsdale, right next to the train station, built by a developer, but restaurant on the first floor, and within 100 yards either side of the front entrance is the public library, which is right across the street. All kinds of retail, underground parking, all the services to stay in the community, but maybe not in that big 4 or 5 bedroom house. We're also seeing clients kind of go off-site and begin to take and leverage their capabilities to do things differently. This is a client where I served on the board as well, Methodist organization that had really built out their main retirement community campus, went and bought a site less than a mile away, converted it into 30 independent living units, but is on sort of the equivalent of Main Street in that town, leveraged the services into that, tried to adopt the sort of college ID idea, so everybody had an embassy card and they negotiated discounts at the 2 coffee shops, a couple of the restaurants that would offer free delivery of food. So leveraging and partnering with other things is, we think, part of that future. We also think that there's a big challenge on the affordable side. This is also a project in Pittsburgh where it was a partnership between a developer, a not-for-profit service provider, faith-based service provider, and the city of Pittsburgh. And the site was made available by the city. That was their big investment because it was right next door to the YMCA. So all of the services, the kind of classes, physical fitness, all those things, we didn't need to replicate any of those, but the residents of this had immediate access right out the front door. The other thing that we think will change, and part of this is driven by the generation and the internet, but consumers are going to demand the best service and value. And they don't really necessarily will always care who provides it. So the sort of one-size-fits-all is going to be different. This is a group in Dallas, Texas that developed with 83 different not-for-profit organizations a building called The Point. It's the art program, the Boys Club, the Gardening Guild. All of them partnered to be able to have this community center, very much focused on intergenerational programming and planning, but it sits on the edge of the CCRC. It sits right on the edge of the retirement community, so folks from the retirement community are participating in these programs, and so the opera and everything else is available to them as a community organization. We're also seeing other clients beginning to partner around their art programs, their theater programs. The auditorium is a 200-seat built by the hospital as part of a retirement community that they sponsored. Right here in the Boston area, the example of LaSalle Village, very interesting in providing this sort of on-campus retirement community option, and we're seeing many, many more talking about it. We had a lot of them on the hook before the recession, a little more diminished in being able to get those pulled off these days. We are seeing developers also interested in, and part of this is leveraging land use approvals. This is a project in Annapolis, very difficult place to get land, very difficult place to get public approvals. We're in our 7th year, and we're still in the public approval process. But it's mixed age housing, so there will be apartments, just market rate apartments. There will be senior apartments, there will be retail. There'll be a little community center, library, and these things are all seen by the master developer as part of creating an age-integrated community, be it from scratch, maybe not in the urban center, but at least making sure that it isn't sort of sitting out on the field all by itself. I think the other thing is we've seen clients doing different things. This is 180 Twist out of Seattle that actually has branded their restaurants as Signature 180, and they are open to the public. They're reviewed by the local culinary critic from the newspaper. They did not see them as being a food service program for residents that lived in their building, but they saw them as a culinary and dining services program and branded it and spun it off as an entirely different company. Mather, out of Evanston, Illinois, very interesting, these Mather cafes. They've done 6 or 7 of them around the greater Chicago area, where they basically are a senior center coupled with both social interaction and options for healthcare and meals. And the idea is addressing some of those challenges that we see about how do people begin to access those services, stay community integrated when they go home to their 1-bedroom apartment or to their home. And certainly the Villages movement, which started here, and we're seeing it replicated in many other places, this sort of virtual, non-physical retirement option where it's a network of services, providers, and volunteers that begin to pull those things together. The World Health Organization identified this notion of age-friendly communities and the 8 sort of components of that. We think that this is where the future needs to be for a lot of our municipalities and beginning to talk. We've become part of a consortium of a group called Vitalocity. Kendall Communities, Ecumen, IBM, Sodexo, Perkins Eastman are partnering to consult to towns and municipalities about how do you begin to meet these aspects of an age-friendly community. And we just did our first workshop in Minnesota just 10 days ago. We also know that seniors are going to expect some continuity with their lifestyle, and so we've had a history of one-size-fits-all. We think that will begin to change as we look at new products and how, this was an exercise we did with a bunch of seniors saying, if you had the same square footage, how would you divide it depending on your interests? And so the person interested in fitness obviously thought very differently about how they would use the space than the messy painter. And I think that's something we have to begin to think about in the future is how do we begin to acknowledge what people want in that lifestyle, that choice, that variety that imprints themselves on that physical environment and their needs. And I think we're going to see communities begin to develop around niche parts of that population group where shared interests become part of the reason that people come together to live in a community aspect, either whether they stay in the community at large or become part of a separate community. And co-housing, I think, is another one that has some promise that we look at as European models sort of translated to the US, and there's some that are under development where people come together and make a proactive life choice decision about working and living together, sharing and supporting each other. So thank you. That was a very fast overview, and I think the panel is going to hopefully pick up on some of those themes and move us along. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And as we come up, and I think it was Valerie first. Yes, we're going to have Valerie Fletcher lead off.
Greetings. I'm going to also talk very fast. Those of us speaking next have 5 minutes. I don't want to short my colleagues, so I'm going to be very quick. We can talk afterwards if you missed something that you were interested in. I run an international nonprofit. Our focus is on the role of design in social inclusion and excellence in design and emphasis. Our parent, you might say, is the positive outcome of the 20th century. Those of us who are also invested in environmental sustainability know that that is born partly of the negative outcome of the 20th century. Our focus is on inclusive design and social sustainability. The measure of progress is demographic. We live longer, we survive more illness and injury, and we have fewer children. Those are the markers for development no matter where you are in the world. Our work is very much focused on its reflection of international policy from the World Health Organization, circa 2001. They redefined disability after 10 years of work. They basically said, with the new demographic, we now have a world in which functional limitation is going to be a mainstream reality for anyone who is not unlucky enough to die young. They also, very significantly, made an enormous invitation to designers. And they said disability is a contextual phenomenon. It's not about those people over there who are fundamentally different from most designers. This is now about the human condition. We need to be thinking about the context in which we live our lives, and that functional limitation becomes disabling if that context is poorly designed. And they thought very wisely in the 21st century about physical, information, communication, policy, and attitudinal or social design. So they saw it as a holistic set of challenges. They also embraced this idea of universal design, not accessibility. They were very clear and said accessibility is about barrier removal. We can't pull this off at a level of barrier removal. The challenge of the 21st century is to design facilitating environments. And they identified universal design as the most promising framework for that. And that was facilitators that were not just about survival, but about health, well-being, independence, participation, and contribution. Really focused on that idea that this was an enormous challenge. It is also important that they identified, and it's very central to our work, and I want to stress this today, the physical issues are significant, but we've got to be holding in our heads at all time physical, sensory, and brain-based or cognitive. And the brain-based is really far more diverse than just cognitive or things like dementia, which is certainly an overarching anxiety. But we need to be thinking about the co-occurring issues of aging that are increasingly common, of anxiety and depression. And what are the contributions of design to influence that? What do we know now? How do we act on all these things? My small contribution this afternoon is partly to get you thinking about, first of all, a need for research. We have an enormous need for research. We partly need research that is based on cost-benefit analysis, but we also need research that is based on real people, not personas, but on real user experts, people with lived experience of different functional abilities who can help us to understand, not in rooms of focus groups, but in real environments, in residential environments, understand what's working and what's not, what would make a difference. And I'd like to suggest that we have a number of precedents that are useful to us. We pay particular attention globally to multifamily housing, which is so much the norm globally. We've done a great deal of work with the Singaporean government, and Singapore began their effort to look at this in doing retrofit of 38 what they call estates. These are usually at the level of 2,000 or more units. And they made a decision, very new country, they made a decision that they were going to plan for aging in place, in the estates, integrated into the whole, through a variety of strategies that was partly about small units integrated across the development, minimizing the use of personal space, maximizing shared space, both indoors and outdoors. And also a focus on research. Is this working? What do we need to tinker with? One of the things they've been looking at is actually sensory changes related to aging. The other people that we have spent a great deal of time working with are our colleagues who look very much like us in so many ways for those of us in New England, and that's the United Kingdom, particularly Britain. And they have made enormous strides in looking at design guidelines on housing. I think they have been far clearer than any of us in the United States in recognizing that we've got to get beyond a presumption about wheelchair use, which is absurd. Today we have 3.6 million Americans who use wheelchairs. We have 30 million Americans who have difficulty walking. Their needs are not the same. And when we look at the aging of the baby boomers, we're looking at 4.3 million Americans who will use wheelchairs in 2030. More wheelchair housing isn't enough. That's the barrier removal thinking. We've got to be thinking more dynamically. And the Brits are actually looking at that. They're looking at issues of privacy in the design of housing for a lifetime. Lifetime housing in places like Olympic Park are now the standard for 100% of every unit. 10% of all units are wheelchair accessible housing. Very appropriate, would never take anything away from that, but to think that is all we need to do is an enormous mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, for some actually inspiring comments about design that facilitates and also about housing for a lifetime. But I'm going to pass it over to Amy and Katie, who are going to give the kind of on-the-ground perspective and a kind of tag team.
So good afternoon. Amy and I decided that we would sort of do this together a little bit. We've become really wonderful friends and really great partners. And if anything, what we've learned is that it takes these kind of deep partnerships over many years to kind of flourish to address the kind of complex problems that we're talking about today. If you read the Boston Globe yesterday, you may have seen Amy's op-ed talking about the mayor's new housing plan. She is locally one of our top leaders in senior housing at Jewish Community Housing of the Elderly, but she also has a real national policy voice. From my perspective, I'm a designer. I run our design program at Enterprise Community Partners. When you saw Chris's bar graph around some of the issues around cost burden, Enterprise is really targeted at relieving housing insecurity in this country. As defined in part, housing insecurity defined in part by paying too much income for rent, being homeless, or in often cases just really being a paycheck away from losing your home. So we're going to tackle a little bit some of the affordable housing issues. We saw some fabulous, beautiful strategies, but our focus is really looking at the vast population of Americans who are not going to have the same kind of choices that many others do. So, we in this report, which we've heard, we understand that housing itself is really sort of the linchpin of well-being, and we find that to be incredibly true. But it also says the existing housing stock is unprepared to meet the escalating need for affordability, accessibility, social connectivity, and supportive services. We think that quality design indeed is critical to meeting these challenges. And it's not just the design of buildings. It's, of course, design is really a process. It's a system. It's user-focused. It's a way of looking at sort of the holistic environment in which we're constructing. So our point of view is that everyone should indeed have the opportunity to age in community. I noticed the hashtag was aging and place. We've heard aging in place, and we want to really put the focus on this notion of aging in community. I was in Brooklyn last week in the Red Hook neighborhood with an incredibly robust organizing group that's working along the riverfront. And they've had incredible successes. I said, what do you look at as the central key to your organizing success? They said, intergenerational community. That's our first key. I was in Cleveland at the opening of the St. Luke's Hospital. It's been reborn with 150 units of senior housing. And then came the intergenerational school on that same campus. And all of a sudden, it's one of the most dynamic places I've ever been. So this notion of how are we thinking about the larger context, I think, is equally as important as the individual features of the building.
So together, Katie and I have had a lot of opportunity to really imagine new settings, to visit success on the ground in the U.S. and abroad, and from learning from each other about what's working for us and what's working for some of the people in our networks. And so we're going to share a few snippets because we can't take you through all of it, but hopefully these provoke some thoughts. We've learned that, David, you pointed out, people don't like small apartments. At the initial stage when people are looking at housing, the size of the apartment seems really important. Once people start living with us, it's almost irrelevant, and it's far less important and significant than the community space and the quality of the programs in that space. A second interesting thing we found is that really good programs in these common spaces can really mitigate any differences in income, socioeconomic background, or any other kind of differences. We have a mixed income development we opened 3 years ago. People were very worried. We were going to have people paying $3,600 a month and people paying $100 a month, and what was it going to feel like? And I have to tell you, when you go into our arthritis exercise class where people walk out with no drugs, pain-free for 4 hours, the difference between you paying $100 and me paying $3,600 is completely irrelevant. Similarly, we have a classic movie club. It doesn't matter where you came from. So those things are real mitigating factors. Third is functional spaces can do social engineering and bring people together. For example, our mailboxes are all in one place at every building. There's social worker staff, resident service coordinator staff in that space, and everybody comes down at the same time each day, and it really brings a lot of things together. Another observation is we certainly have gyms in all of our buildings, but we also take any fitness equipment that you can't hurt yourself on, that you don't need supervision, and it's scattered throughout the buildings. And this both allows people at odd hours, we don't have staff at 2 a.m. In the gym, but people can do it at whatever their schedule is, and it also promotes a lot of liveliness in the corridors. Another quick lesson is that adaptable spaces are best spaces. We watch how people use them, and then we reinforce. We had a guerrilla gardener group at one of our houses. They took an area, they took it over, and now we support it with raised beds and all the sort of things that goes. So from watching what Enterprise has done in other places, we've learned a few important things too. Look for the triple win: resident comfort, health, and sustainability. And here's one seemingly little example, but it's, I think, illustrative. So they replaced, I think it was a cathedral in Vermont, the 3.6 gallon flush toilet with new ones, but they're ADA height toilets. And so it's now 1 gallon per flush, but people are more comfortable because they're a height meant for people who are older. So everybody won, although we made one mistake in one of our buildings, and it was so water efficient that people were flushing 4 times, and so don't pick one of those. That wasn't a good idea. Certainly, Enterprise has been advocating that preservation and enhancement of existing housing is way more environmentally smart and thoughtful and fast than always looking to build the new building. And so some of the things we're looking at together going forward is Levensloopbestendige, which is it is the apartments for life that David showed, but I think it sounds cooler in Dutch. And so I say it. As David had pointed us there, I went to the Netherlands and visited the building he showed, and actually, JCHE, we flew the guy who built those into Boston. We had a little seminar, and he spoke to our board and staff about us becoming Apartments for Life providers, which has all sorts of regulatory problems, but we're going to do it, so stay tuned to that. We're also in all our new buildings seeing our housing as village centers for the senior community, not as standalone, but actually drawing people in, including public ground floor spaces to draw neighbors in and people of all ages. In the building you showed, you didn't mention they have a bar, and it's a really cool hangout bar, and I think that's a great thing to do. And you talked a little bit about affinity housing, and we're looking at it. It's much harder, of course, to do in affordable, but for us, we're looking at something called Tikkun Olam House. Tikkun Olam means repair of the world, and what if to get in you had to commit to social justice and advancing that, and we're looking at many different things like that. And
there was discussion on the phone about shared housing and some of the difficulties in that. And so I was glad to find out that our Enterprise Rose Fellow working with Presbyterian Senior Living is actually doing a grant research project right now and trying to look at these sort of shared environments where maybe there are shared kitchens and individual bedrooms. Should I skip this part? I'll do it. Okay, we'll do this part. I know we're a little bit cognizant of time. So, we're also very aware in the affordable sector, of course, in any of these sectors, regulations and financing and policy has such an effect. What we know is, of course, that the private market can only really achieve the top 5 or 10% to fill. And so the idea that, I guess, CCRCs, as your presentation, are maybe have been the past, but are certainly not our future. So there are going to be major gaps in our ability for middle income. I think that JCHE has had to really rely on philanthropy to support some of their mixed income and middle income housing. And then, of course, at the sort of federal level, the shift away from Section 202s to the housing tax credit projects creates a little bit of a barbell effect and constrains our ability in some ways, according to some of the regulations of the tax credit program, including things like no mandatory meal programs and other things that seem to make common sense for the sort of strategies of community building, but are not necessarily built into that program.
Enterprise is absolutely vital for our ability to succeed, and we've had these incredible, cool collaborations. So we thought we'd just highlight a few of them to show you how the partnership with a national organization and a local on the ground really creates a lot of synergy.
So Amy and I met here, actually, at the GSD in 2011, I believe, when we hosted the Affordable Housing Design Leadership Institute here, a program we do every day or every year in affordable housing generally. And we always like to have at least one senior housing project in our midst because, of course, the lessons apply across all different kinds of housing types. So it's been really critical for us to bring together top-notch designers and developers to focus on things that don't always come up in housing development. The importance of landscape architecture, active design principles, the importance of health and well-being and nature, ideas around stress reduction, and other sort of larger thought patterns, really, in good design.
And when you combine that for us with a problem-solving setting, so we brought a problem we were having, they helped us solve it. We got the best minds, but in a way that really stuck and had us able to integrate it into everything else we do.
So the next, our next little project together, Enterprise developed the Green Communities criteria originally in 2004 as the green building sort of methodology for affordable housing. We've done a number of iterations, but in 2011, we partnered with JCHE and others to do a sort of universal design overlay. We're in the process of doing a new run of that criteria now that will involve larger focus on resiliency and some other issues as well.
And with that shirt, we brought in the Institute for Human-Centered Design, and we're applying those lessons every day.
So the next thing we did was make one of our pre-development design grants to JCHE. One of the things we realized through the Design Leadership Institute is that, if 70% of design decisions are made in the first 10% of the project, and there's often no money and sort of no time for that kind of deep design at that moment. So we created a grant program which funds some of that early design thinking, and JCHE took advantage.
It's brilliant. Think about it. Before you have site control, you can't justify, if you're a nonprofit, to your board spending a lot of money on design. So we didn't, but through this process, we got 4 brilliant architects and fabulous concepts, and now we're actually using all 4 on different projects.
And last, but certainly not least, Enterprise started the Enterprise Rose Fellowship program to get young architects into affordable housing in the year 2000. Shout out to the students because I'm really proud and impressed that you're here. This is the room you should be in today, actually. The market for this field is growing so fast. We didn't have fellows working specifically in senior housing really until we got a fellow in the St. Luke's project, and then another fellow working with a senior housing group in Vermont, then one in Pennsylvania. We know we need this kind of human-centered design research and other things specifically around the design of affordable housing for seniors. So we've been through these through these talented young architects who work with community developers and with the people who live in these developments for a 3-year period, building sort of a research and design base. And JCHE is going to have a fellow.
Yay! Starting January 1st for 3 years, so come back in 3 years, we'll have so much to say.
Well, so thank you very much. So I actually want to lead off with the first question. And we've heard a lot about new construction and about design guidelines for new construction, designs for new construction, and so on. But most people are living in existing communities. And one of the issues is often portrayed as this future of isolation in the existing community, even if it's the place you've always been as your friends depart in various ways. So are there any lessons from this new construction and the design guidelines for aging in place in existing communities, for retrofitting rather than new build? Actually, David, I wonder if you could start off.
Well, some of the challenges are that the housing stock not only isn't accessible, you can't even get to the front door of the buildings. And I think that we've also seen a lot of older housing product that many don't have elevators in them. There's a joke in Pittsburgh that we need an elevator foundation because we have all this wonderful housing stock above the first floor retail, but they're in buildings that are 18 feet wide and 50 feet deep, and there's basically room for maybe a couple of units per floor. And the issue is the cost of the elevator overwhelms the cost of converting that housing for accessible use. So I think there are a lot of the principles, and I think some of the things that Valerie talked about that certainly apply to any way we look in retrofitting units. But I think we have some fundamental issues with our housing stock, and in some communities, and Boston's a good example, and parts of Washington, D.C. and other cities where it's not a level site or level playing field to begin to develop that housing stock.
Valerie?
Among the things that we're fascinated by is what are the design features, what are the facilitators for an environment in which in our country, chronic health conditions are becoming a pervasive reality of what constitutes disability, and thinking about what actually makes a difference. And some of that is a nice overlap with environmental sustainability, because it has to do with indoor air quality and features like that that can make a big difference. I think we have a long way to go to figure that out. One of the things that we look at a lot, and we'd like to do a lot more research on it, has to do with lighting and acoustics. And the ways in which those can be substantial assets in renovation, but things that we don't really think much about.
I'm wondering about not only retrofitting the housing units themselves, but the communities more generally for sociability. And I wonder if either Enterprise or David have some comments about that.
Well, I think just a quick to pick up on the study is that we've got a large percentage of our population that lives in areas where there aren't even sidewalks. So how are we going to deal with transportation, visitability of these issues if we don't even have sidewalks that network people together? And we've got a lot of zoning and land use regulations that really keep people isolated because this is residential and that's shopping. I went back to a place I grew up and the little corner store's gone. There's now a house on the site. And it was the place that everybody went to. It was the thing right in the neighborhood and got zoned right out. So I think we need to look at zoning and land use patterns to be able to do this, but then we've got a lot of infrastructure pieces I think we need to deal with.
I think the project that you brought to HDLI was a rehab, actually. And, you know, one of the things that we learned then from Amy was that chronic loneliness is one of our greatest health hazards for the senior population. That I believe you can actually measure blood pressure and, you know, these sort of effects of loneliness. And so certainly, you know, in the preservation of both the affordability of housing and of a sort of green retrofit of the buildings themselves, this kind of the ability to be able to retrofit or redesign the campus and the social spaces is often, in fact, some of the most difficult, but actually probably the most important.
Amy?
No, I agree. I just add that chronic loneliness, now all the research shows it's actually more of a health hazard for seniors than obesity or smoking. It has risen to that level. Baby boomers on average will live 9 years after their ability to drive. And the fact that so many people, the vast majority, live in suburban, single-family homes in suburban tracts suggests that there just is no platform for delivering the kind of social connectivity and services that supportive housing in a common area near transit can provide. There's just nothing that's going to work in that way, so I think we should recognize that.
And I think there are solutions that don't cost money. I mean, in one of these community studies that we did, the issue was just adjusting where the bus stops were. They realized that they had a bus stop that was just 1.5 blocks from one of the apartment buildings that was basically a naturally occurring retirement community. And by just adjusting the bus stop, it gave much better access to the transit system. Didn't cost anything, wasn't another bus. It was just thinking strategically about where it stopped.
One of the things that we've been looking at is actually the policy issues around pets, and really thinking about flexibility around pets. And that extends to local parks. We've actually been tracking elderly women and their willingness to keep a pet and be able to manage that pet. And the no dogs allowed parks that seem to be proliferating are actually an impediment to that, because people won't go. If they can't bring the dog, they're not going to the park alone. But it's a small thing, largely cost neutral, but has a big effect on loneliness and quality of life, and it's a policy change.
And one of the things at the Design Institute that we did, we were looking at our site. In fact, we have places on all our sites where pets can be brought, and that came out of the Design Institute too.
I'd like to say that if people have questions, they can come up to the front microphone, but I'm just going to give you one more question. We started to talk a bit about the issues of like cognitive impairment, loneliness, depression, and so on. And as the proportion of people over 80 is going to quadruple worldwide, this is potentially a large issue as people outlive their partners, spouses, and families. But it's one of the more difficult issues to face in terms of designing homes and communities. What would be, do you think, are sort of important steps we could take to prepare for this sort of coming wave of folks with mental, cognitive, and other difficulties?
So I'll jump in and then other people. I think we're starting to do that already, and we're already behind. There are easy physical design things about colors and light levels and visibility that we've done. Leading Age partnered with, was it AARP or, Enterprise partnered with Leading Age for the Learning Collaborative. So last year they gave us a grant to look at a method called habilitation therapy that had been designed for nursing home care by the Alzheimer's Association, but they wanted to figure out if it could work for housing, and we wanted to figure out what could work for housing. So over the year, we trained almost 100% of our staff on this method, and in doing so, adapted the method so it no longer is a nursing home or assisted living method, but it's actually a housing method, and that was through this enterprise support. And now I'll just put a plug. It's on our website. We have a free guide that we published as a result of this year-long effort, so all senior housing providers can train their own staff on how to help people with dementia and therefore keep them much longer.
And I think the caregiver side of this is a big equation, because we sometimes focus on the individual with the impairment and not maybe the caregiver that's been there, and the burnout issues, the transition issues, the support, the things that keep them healthy, I think are things that we have not focused as much on. And sometimes that may be the first line for a certain percentage of the population that actually have somebody, a partner or a spouse, that can help support that, but a lot of our programs and buildings don't.
Right.
A small issue that we don't pay much attention to in this country, I was actually at an Institute of Medicine event in January that was focused entirely on the hearing loss, and healthy aging. And the reality is that we don't pay much attention. It is the sensory loss that we don't acknowledge. And it's a big contributor to isolation and loneliness when people lose partners who are used to tolerating their difficulty hearing. So isolation is a better answer for many people, and we've got to start taking it seriously. Only 14% of people with hearing loss, and we're looking at about 27 million Americans over 50 have hearing loss. Only 14% use hearing aids, and most of those live in sock drawers and jewelry boxes. So it's a big issue and unacknowledged.
I know everyone has their own personal story here. My grandmother is 97. Her husband died last week. He was 93. And they were living at home together in Bethesda. She'd been married to her first husband for 35 years and her second husband for 43 years. You know, it's unbelievable, right? Yeah. But so it's this moment now. She's now 97. She's about this big. She's doing very well, actually. But, you know, and listen, I think the fact is her goal will be to die in her home, and not soon, by the way. Right. So great, she's got wonderful neighbors. We're sorting out care. She has enough resources to be able to sort of enable this. But you know, the numbers, this 90% of people say they want to age in their home. Well, what's the question that we're really asking people, and how can we really reframe that question so that we're not just retrofitting situations that are difficult, right? But that we're moving earlier. You know, maybe the sort of empty nester concept takes hold in a way that's not about spending your newfound resources once your kids are out of college on a nice rehab of your big home in the suburbs, but is really about this shift, so that if we get more consciousness about what's coming down the pike for all of us as a country and sort of focus on this more clear agenda about moving, whether it's back to the cities or into more dense environments, and doing the kind of good urban design principles based on intergenerational success, I just have to think that that's got to be where we need to put so much of our attention.
Can we play with that idea for 1 sec?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to have a little bit of fun. So I'm going to ask you a question. You have to raise your hand. I'll tell you what the two choices are. So if you had a really good quality of life and you were happy, so you got to hold quality of life as a non-moving variable. Would you rather live to 80 or 85 with a good quality of life? That's going to be your two choices. So how many would like to kick off and lose those last 5 years of life at 80? How many want to live to 85? Pretty overwhelming. How many people, none of us want to end our life in a nursing home, fair enough? But if you have to go into a nursing home and end your life, you're going to choose between going in at age 79 and doing the years, or 88 and probably doing the weeks. So how many would like to go in at 79? How many would like to go in at 88? Okay, just one more. If you're aging, you're in that 80 to 85, you just got those 5 extra years, would you like to have a very high blood pressure, high depression rates, and your immune system severely depressed, and if you have a cognitive disparity, to have it decline twice as fast?
Amy,
or
all of them?
Or would you like to have, without drugs, low blood pressure, a very robust immune system, low rate of depression, and a 50% slower rate of decline of any cognitive impairments? How many want the first, the bad, and how many want the second? Okay, so just 2 points from that, right? It's pretty overwhelming. One, the way you ask the question completely sets the answer. Now, you just all answered that you don't want to do the traditional aging in place. You do want to live in a supportive senior housing environment, because all those things have been documented, researched, university after university, are different. So how you ask the question really affects how you answer the question. And the second piece is the gap between what people know and what they need to know in terms of making the choices that the Harvard report points out about responsibility for making those choices is ginormous. And we as professionals have an incredibly hard task. I have no idea how we're going to do it. But getting all that information out in a way people can digest and understand is a big challenge for us.
Is that question framed that way available on your website?
Brittany, it will be. Thanks for that suggestion.
Oh, well, that's actually a fantastic action to come out of this. I just want to move on a little bit more, just to focus on one of the groups that really struck me in the report from the Joint Center, which is the folks who are income eligible for affordable housing or subsidized housing but don't get it, a large percentage of the population. And so far, a lot of our conversation has been about either people who do manage to get into income-assisted living or people who have means to afford other alternatives. But what about that group of renters or very, very low-income homeowners who aren't in assisted living, aren't likely to be in the next little while? What are some other options for those folks?
Are you going to answer? We have an answer.
Thank you for asking that question. My name is Bob Downing, and since I'll probably ask a couple more questions before the afternoon is finished, I can say that my interest in this is my company has an unlimited supply of money to finance the facilities like you're discussing, and there's hundreds of millions of them under construction now in other areas besides Massachusetts. And my question, though, is about design and how you think. I know how Amy thinks. I'm wondering do you think about people in categories, not just by age, but whether or not they have any money, or whether or not they have a disability? Because I know from affordable housing experience of over 40 years, 50 maybe, that we only recently started thinking about people with disabilities. So when you think of David, for example, you had these beautiful facilities that you designed, but aren't they mostly for people who are walking around and going to the fitness center and stuff? Or do you think about the poor people who need care every day, but not nursing home care?
Well, go
Go ahead. No.
I guess, people are people of all ages. I think it's really interesting the kind of degree of either a sort of real participatory design process, a real human-centered design process, versus a kind of generic design process is really important. And I'm sure Valerie can speak very eloquently to this. In some ways, one of the places we've gotten to learn so much is actually on Skid Row in Los Angeles, where we've helped to, be a part of the sort of community design and participatory design of a number of new housing. Typically, they're single room or apartments, rather, for homeless individuals. But, going through building after building and actually looking at what's really working. I mean, I liked Amy's suggestion that, you make it flexible potentially at first and then you see what's working. And actually, we have a GSD-educated Rose Fellow there, Teresa Wong, who has spent the last 5 or 6 years doing this kind of very intensive process with residents of the building and analyzing past decisions and sort of current realities and doing this kind of very specific design work. And, I think that on the one hand, of course, design needs to be flexible and adaptive, but when it's just generic or vanilla and we're not getting the kind of nuance of human use and real needs, that we're sort of really missing the boat on that. I think that process can be intensive, right? But it has other benefits too, because when you're deeply engaging with the residents of your building or of your neighborhood or of the area, you're not only getting a better design, you're getting kind of a better whole outcome because everybody's really benefiting from that process.
Can I speak? Thank you. Part of what's so thrilling about this report is that the Joint Center for Housing Studies issued it, because it isn't that other people haven't been singing this song and banging on the drum for this. It's that you set a new level of attention and an enormous opportunity to act. I think part of what we have to admit is that we don't know a lot of what works. We actually just did a very small project for the city of Cambridge, and they basically said, would you do this? We want to do something on elders in transit, and we have 3 schemes, and we want to do 2 public meetings, or 2 schemes and 3 public meetings. We sort of know what that's about. It's a great way to sort of get outcomes that you can predict and to a large extent control. We said what we'd like to do is actually recruit a group of elders to actually analyze the system in situ. And we're going to look at the physical, the information, the communication, the policy, the attitudinal environment. And out of that came a rich set of very detailed issues that most people pay no attention to whatsoever. I would say 80% were without cost. They were extremely modest, but they were inhibiting people from being out, from going places, to visiting friends, to simply being independent. And it was extraordinary. We can do that in housing, and Massachusetts is the ideal place to undertake that kind of user expert research.
And just to finish up with one sentence, so you posed the question, what about all the people, and like a lot of them are on our waiting list. The truth is, that given the cost of housing in Massachusetts and in many places, there is no solution short of subsidized housing. And I don't think we should give up on the notion. In Europe, in many parts of the civilized world, anyone who needs housing gets housing. And I think the fact that the 2.0 program died, and we're sitting here like calmly saying that as if it's normal words, as opposed to a national tragedy that this report points out, we're missing the boat on that one.
Okay, okay, I want to ask whether focusing on housing for the aging is the right way to think about it. And to clarify why I asked this, I just went through the process of deciding where I want to live for the rest of my life. And I chose one of the Massachusetts designated transit-centered smart growth areas, and I bought into a condominium building. And something I noticed is that wheelchair accessibility and a lot of the other accessibility features have negative cost, because as I shop for buildings, a little bit wider hallways increase the market price because they have good feng shui. And so if you design a good place, it actually turns out that the sorts of things you need for accessibility increase the market value more than their cost if you do it right. Sure. The other thing is I bought into a building that serves basically bimodal group. It serves young families with 1 or 2 kids who are crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment, but that's what they can afford. And it serves people actually a lot older than I am. I'm one of the youngest people in the older group. And it actually gives real life to the building, that we've got little kids running up and down the hallways with their tricycles. And so I specifically did not move into a retirement community.
I think it's a very good point, and I think the other fascinating thing is that we're seeing many, many crossovers around sort of generational and lifestyle aspirations. And so, you know, one of the things that's out there now in the multifamily housing is the micro unit. And, you know, sort of how small can you go? And we're seeing lots of developers interested in it because in very expensive urban markets, you know, Boston, DC, New York, this appeals to a group of individuals who are in that sort of out of college to early 30s. They don't have the kids and the toys and everything that go with it. But just as appealing to that group is what the developer is finding, is that they're finding as many 65-plus-year-olds that are showing up on their list who is not what their target audience was they thought when they went into it, because they have the same challenges of finding affordable housing that keeps them in the urban center, near transit and everything else. So I think we're going to find a lot of crossovers and a lot of shared ideas there.
Follow on to that point, the Automobile Association of America says that the average car costs $9,000 a year. A couple in the suburbs, that's $18,000. I think we have to look at this from an intergenerational standpoint and build on the fact that the most walkable communities in America are in college towns. 2,500 universities in the United States combine the needs of millennials, college students, and baby boomers, and we can build on that.
Great.
Well, actually, with that, though, I'm actually going to say that's the last question I'm allowing for this group, because I want to have a moment when for the panel, which is the first panel, to talk to the second panel. So we've talked a lot about design, planning, and place, and the second panel is discussing policy questions and sort of broader issues. And so I wonder, from the perspective of housing and neighbour design, what are some questions that you'd like to pass on to the next panel?
Okay, should I start? Okay. Here's this thing that makes me nuts, so I want you to solve it. Okay. The 202 program's dead, and the only game in town is the low-income housing tax credit. Okay? So we built a building recently with a low-income housing tax credit, but before we built a 202 building. The low-income housing tax credit building, we spent 16.5% of our development costs on transaction costs. Lawyers, accountants. That's, okay, 2.2 million it came to. Okay, so, I mean, sort of cyclical, they're the ones who can afford the CCRCs you're designing, but otherwise, contrast that to when we built Golden Mayer House, 1.8%. 1.8% transaction costs. It was less than $100,000. So do we want to siphon off, and if you multiply this times 1,000 projects, you know, millions and millions and millions of dollars to transaction costs instead of what we can do with those programs and services and exciting things. So as policy people, how are we letting that happen? And then the second part of that question is the gap I talked about in knowledge about aging and community and what the benefits are. How can we as professionals get that word out?
I think I'll take a housing and transportation angle. We got some good news, I think, in Dorchester just yesterday, that they're opening the Fairmount line on the weekends. You know, is that 10, 12, 15 years of activism to get that neighborhood? Maybe 20. Those of you who know can attest to the fact that the kind of transit inequities that we have can help us actually address some of these issues about rehabilitation, staying in place, aging in the community that you're in a way that is healthy and vibrant. So I think, you know, we've had a lot of success in some communities, like in Denver. We've started a new sort of transit-oriented development fund that's fueling money to housing near transit. But this combination of both more transit-oriented development and greater investment in really workable transit opportunities in especially reaching low-income neighborhoods.
Very important.
I'm actually remembering something I don't think about or mention very often. I happen to have a very bizarre background with training at this university. I have something called, I have a degree in ethics and public policy. and my obsession, I actually was sort of mid-career, I finished in 1989, but my obsession was actually to avoid the unintended consequences of good public policy. And I have never missed a day of thinking about that issue. I actually have a couple of things that I'd like to suggest. I have done way too much affordable housing to have tremendous optimism that we're going to see a great deal more public money. But I think we have a real need to argue for public policy that says we need more research. And I think Harvard would be a great place to actually pick this up, because we need more cost-benefit analysis. We need data that tells developers that we know what works. I am tired of arguing with Medicaid and Medicare about the role of investment upstream. But we need better data. They aren't going to give it to us. We have to deliver that data. And lastly, I think enterprise has been brilliant over time as a place that people look to incentivize change. A little bit of money goes a long way to incentivize that, and to be able to share that. We are at a moment of desperation. We need easy places to find all this data. I think your next publication ought to be a website where these great stories are shared and readily updated constantly and are global.
I think maybe one last challenge, and maybe because of the things that we've talked about here, is that Amy talked about social engineering with the mailboxes. Well, we know public policy is another form of social engineering. And I think that what we haven't seen is the incentivizing of the kinds of issues that we're talking about here to make our urban centers senior friendly or aging friendly. And I think we need to use public policy to begin to drive that. And we look at, you talk about transaction costs. What scares me sometimes are the infrastructure development costs with building permits and land use development, things that I think if we had, and we work in China, so I know the Chinese government can do anything they want, but they've decided that senior housing is important, and so they have public policy that drives the land value to a point that makes it affordable to be senior and not the market or high-end market. And how do we begin to do that and begin to challenge the way we look at our land resources in our city centers?
Well, thank you for a very provocative discussion. And I look forward to hearing how the second panel will answer all these questions. Now we have a 15-minute break, and we'll be back at 3:15 promptly. See you soon.